Hello, I'm David Healy, and 40 years ago or so nearly, I did something strange. I dropped out of a good medical job which paid well to go and do research in a lab which paid almost nothing for about 4 years. It was as though a kind of fortune teller said to me, this might be a good idea. And, it didn't turn out too badly. First of all, the lab that I went to, one of the few things you could really do there was look at serotonin in people who are depressed, and there were hints that um, that the serotonin levels in people who are depressed mightn't be quite right. Problem with this was I learned pretty quickly that things like serotonin levels can look low at one point in the day in people who are depressed, but later in the day they can look absolutely normal or even high. So there's a big gap between bits of information we get which become solid facts and bits of information which can underpin claims. And one of the things about the pharmaceutical industry is they're really good at being able to pick up bits of information that can support claims and march through the gap between facts and claims and try and persuade people this is what the science shows, but it's really biobabble. It's good propaganda. Now, the other fortunate thing that happened was about 2 years after I went to this lab, the first SSRI, first selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, was launched in Europe. People elsewhere haven't heard of this drug, but Prozac was only about the fifth of the SSRIs. This got withdrawn from the market in Europe because it caused problems, so that's why you haven't heard about it. But my background in working on at the serotonin system and the fact that these drugs were coming on the market meant I looked like the perfect person for the pharmaceutical companies to use to educate doctors about what these drugs were likely to do. And it also meant when I went to at the psychopharmacology meetings that the people who had made the discoveries and things like that were happy to talk to me because they saw a person linked to the industry who'd worked in the lab. And, I sounded like I was going to be an easy person to be interviewed by, someone who was sympathetic. And I was, although I took the opportunity as well to get people to interview who I knew hated each other and put the interviews side by side so you could get some idea about how the science really works. Among the most interesting people that I interviewed was this man here, Arvid Carlson, who made the first SSRI and later got a Nobel Prize. And what was interesting about him and the other people who were really interesting was the people who listened to patients and said, oh, that's interesting, and who kept things simple. They're the ones who seem to make the breakthroughs. Now, there's nothing simple looking about this slide here, which was the first four antidepressants in essence. They all will look the same to you and they look the same to me. But doctors were saying to Carlson and kind of patients also that the two on the top are pretty similar, but the bottom left one is different to the two on the top, and it's very different to the bottom right one. Looking at this, Carlson was able to say to people, look, well, all of these drugs inhibit norepinephrine reuptake. The bottom left one has very little effects on the serotonin system. The bottom right one is the one that has the most effects on the serotonin system. And looks like it's something interesting, a serenic effect, an anxiolytic effect. So let's try and make a pure serotonin reuptake inhibitor and see what we get. So that's where these drugs came from. There was no sense that anyone thought there was anything wrong with the serotonin system in people who are depressed. If there was something wrong, the drugs wouldn't have worked. So Carlson changed the way we view the brain from looking at brain function to looking at levels of things like serotonin and dopamine. But he still thought, as Walter Hess, whom you see here, thought, who also won a Nobel Prize, that prior to the Carlson breakthroughs, people like Hess were saying, what's the function of this brain system or endocrine system or whatever? And the important function for the young men who were PhD students with him was, well, why do I fall in love with a girl? It was an answer to important questions like that that people needed to be focused on. When the serotonin reuptake inhibitors came on the market first in the late 80s and early 90s, it was very clear to an insider like me there was nothing wrong with the serotonin system in people who were depressed. These were not good antidepressants. They were much better serenics or anxiolytics. That is, they could chill you out if they were the right drug for you. But we had a benzodiazepine dependence crisis, which meant that the marketing thought it would be a better idea to say they were antidepressants because people didn't expect you to get hooked to an antidepressant, whereas they did expect you to get hooked to a tranquilizer. So 2 years later, I was chairing the launch meeting for Zoloft for Pfizer for Zoloft in the UK. And at it, I gave this talk, which again seemed an awfully obvious thing to an insider back then. And the talk said, reasonably simply, serotonin is more primitive than estrogen or testosterone. If we now have drugs that work on it, it's going to show us things that we didn't know about before. Maybe benefits that we can use or possibly problems. So we need to keep our eyes open to what's going on. This was not the message Pfizer were in the business of trying to deliver. Their message was, we know everything about Zoloft, and the only job for a doctor is to prescribe these drugs, and the only drug for a patient, the only job for a patient is to take the drug. This is caught beautifully in a cartoon that came out from Michael Leunig a few years later. It was clear to him that this was a mythic idea. We had no evidence that there was a simple chemical imbalance in the brain at all, or that these drugs were going to be a bit like vitamin serotonin. But it was part of the process of converting cases of Valium to Prozac and Zoloft, and removing the scruples we might have about taking these drugs. As regards to scruples about taking these drugs, this cartoon, or this image from a book, I think says a lot. I'm not going to be talking much at all about the suicidal effects of these drugs, although I will be talking about the homicidal effects. But the Dutch here says nothing is out of hand. But when you look at the image, it's saying just the opposite, that things aren't in control. So let me move on. There's two pillars on which this talk is built, and here's one of them. This is a lady called Anne-Marie, who fairly soon after I was involved in helping set up a thing called risk.org, which is a place where people could report the adverse effects they were having on the drugs they were on. She reported that, she thought the SSRIs that she'd been taking had caused her to become alcoholic. Her doctor said this is crazy thinking. And AA, when she was referred to AA and she said this, they said, this just proves you're an alcoholic. This is alcoholic thinking. But turned out she was right and they were all wrong. And her experience, which was recorded in a risk post that hundreds of people have responded to and said, yes, this is just what happened to me. Her experience is now built into the Canadian guidelines for treating alcohol use disorders and other substance use disorders. We've begun to recognize not only can SSRIs cause people to drink, not only is it not a great idea to use them to treat people who are drinking, but that the antidepressants and antipsychotics we use can cause other substance abuse problems also. The other pillar on which this talk is built is here. It comes from these two guys, William James and Carl Lange, from the 1880s, so a long, long time ago, where they said, our emotions come from our bodies, not our brains, that our bodies intuit things, they feel things, and our brain's trying to work out what this arousal means and often gets it wrong. Now, these days, when we can look into brains in a way that we couldn't look into them back then, that probably sounds like a very primitive idea. But in fact, when the psychopharmacology era began in the 1950s, this idea underpinned a lot of the early drugs that were introduced. Previous to the 1950s, when we tried to treat nervous problems, we often sedated people. We put them to sleep. New drugs like Miltown and Librium and Valium, were drugs that treated anxiety without putting you to sleep. People were wide awake, they could go about their jobs, they were even doing their jobs more efficiently than they were doing before, which didn't surprise people because the sense was that, look, you're fooling the brain. We're giving these drugs which relax muscles, which are the kind of thing that the brain is trying to interpret and says, oh, these tense muscles means this guy is anxious. If you relax the muscles, you can fool the brain. And when you halt the drug, one of the things that happens is you can get a rebound of anxiety or tension or insomnia and things like that, again, which the brain attributes to the person rather than the underlying muscle state. Now, that may be a bit hard to believe in the case of the benzodiazepines, but exactly the same thing applied to a different group of drugs used to treat nervous problems, and these were the beta blocker group of drugs. These are drugs that slow your heart rate, ease the shake you might have in your hand, slow your respiratory rate, and things like this. All the features we have when we get anxious. And they've been used to treat people who are anxious, because if you slow the heart rate and all and remove the shake from your hands and the quaver from your voice, the brain will assume, oh, this guy must be quite relaxed. And that helps you to relax. Now, a lot of doctors use these pills as well to treat blood pressure problems and cardiac problems and things like that. Doctors who have no reason to think about mental illness or things like that, or even brains. And when they stop the drugs, they often say to patients, look, when you stop this drug, your heart rate's going to go up. There might be a shake in your hands, a quaver in your voice. You might think you're anxious. You're not. This is just a temporary effect of changes in the body, which the brain is going to misinterpret. An interesting thing happened to me over 40 years ago when I was in a pharmacology practical, and I had to give my partner a beta blocker. It was to prove to us about what beta blockers do, which is to slow heart rates. This was the universal truth about these drugs. So I gave her the pill, and a short while afterwards, she became anxious. Now, when we checked her heart rate had increased. She had no reason to think she was going to be anxious after this pill. She becomes anxious because her heart rate increases, which tells you one thing, but the other thing it tells you is this, which is you don't want to believe the averages that might appear in books. Reality is what happens in front of us to the person in front of us. And if a drug which slows most people's hearts causes a person's heart to increase, this is the reality in their case. Now, I'm going to ask for a little bit of leeway from all of you when I say brains don't count. I mean in this that human brains don't count. This is T-Rex, and as you can see there, he's got very little brain. Most of his head is a jaw. There's maybe a teeny bit of brain just above his eyes there, but compared to the human cortex you see on the right-hand side, the pink bit, the reptile brain, the T-Rex brain or the bird brain is the bit that isn't pink there, the little bit coming up from the spinal cord, the top of the spinal cord. That's the reptile brain. It's very efficient. It's got no scruples, conscience. It's not trying to interpret things. It's just efficient. It's got this blue dot you see there. And when we humans take opioids and get hooked to them, one of the things that happens is they slow our heart and respiratory rate, and we can die because of this. The blue dot takes care of our heart rate and respiratory rate. It speeds them up to compensate so that we don't die. If we then all of a sudden stop the opioid, we're left with a racing heart, increased respiratory rate, perspiring, shaking, etc., etc., etc. All of these things, which are bodily effects, nothing to do with the brain at all. But the interesting thing about it is we can shut the blue dot off without acting on the opioid system at all, acting on the adrenaline system, the epinephrine system. We can shut it off and stop opioid withdrawal dead. And that's an important point that's going to come back later on in this talk. So let me take you to a unit in North Wales, a wonderful unit that I worked in for years, great staff, great patients, nice place to work. And we thought we'd do a healthy volunteer experiment here, which tested Carlson's idea. Could a bunch of doctors and nurses who are given an SSRI or a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor tell the difference between them. They'd be 2 weeks on one, then crossed over to the other for the other 2 weeks, blind to which drug they were on. And the answer was, yes, they could. Carlson's idea was right. But we learned a lot more than that, which was none of the patients in the unit knew that this was going on or that any of the staff were on any pills that they wouldn't normally be on or whatever. But within 24 hours, some of the patients were able to tell me, one of my colleagues say, "Doctor, he's on pills, isn't he?" And they're able to tell me what pill he was on. He's on an SSRI. This was not the kind of thing you're told about these drugs. You're told that they take weeks and weeks to work. But we had patients who aren't trained scientists able to observe what the staff, people like me, wouldn't be able to see in them the other way around, which taught me, interesting, that motivation is worth more than expertise. And it also fits the James Lang view of things about the antidepressants, that just like the benzodiazepines and all, it's not what we expect. It's the brain has been fooled by bodily changes which people on the outside can spot. One of the interesting things about all this is that we seem not, lots of the time, be able for our left hand to know what the right hand's doing. In this case, Lucy, with her left or right hand or whatever, enjoys teasing Charlie Brown, but all of a sudden things go wrong, and she knows what's wrong here, which is Charlie Brown is emotionally numbed. These drugs have reduced sensory input, reduced feeling, and it means that he's not bothered in the way that he's usually bothered, and Lucy hates this. Here's another piece of research that fits straight into what we saw with our healthy volunteers and Lucy saw, which is on the left, you got a brain scan of a bunch of healthy volunteers before they take an SSRI, and the brain's all lit up. And on the right, you've got a brain scan taken a few hours after they have one dose of an SSRI, and the researchers are left saying, hey, look, this SSRI has turned the brain off. It hasn't. It hasn't turned the brain off, partly because there's very little serotonin in your and my brain. Only 5% or less of the serotonin in us is in our brains. What's happened is that the SSRI has turned sensation off. It's acted on a bunch of sensory receptors around our body to turn feelings off, which leave us saying, I've become emotionally numb after I've taken this drug. I'm less reactive. So this is a very important point, partly because if you're a criminal lawyer or a jury in a criminal trial faced with a person on an SSRI who's maybe killed someone, or if you're living with a person who's on one of these drugs, or if you're the person who's on one of these drugs, one of the important things for all of us is trying to work out how responsible people are for their actions. And as you're going to hear later, most of our actions are reflex. They're automatic. They're not voluntary. And most of them have an input from the sensory system first, leading to a motor reflex. But if the input to the sensory system is abnormal, a lot of our automatic behavior, the kind of stuff that makes up our personality and all, is going to change. And no legal system, or none of us dealing with friends and all who are on these drugs, or even partners or whatever, have worked out how to take this into account. That's going to become a critical point later on in this talk. But in the case of the benzodiazepines and the beta blockers, we learned a lot about what these drugs do by stopping them. And we're going to stop the antidepressants now and see what happens. But just quickly to mention, within a few years of these drugs coming on the market first, it was very, very clear that most people who are on them were on them chronically. Initially, right at the start, most people have just been put on them for the first time and nobody's on them chronically. But within about 3 or 4 years, there's a crossover. And by the time the drugs have been on the market for 5 or 10 years, most people on them are on them chronically because they can't get off. And this is a major public health crisis. Now, if I'm going to talk about not being able to get off and withdrawal, what am I doing putting up a slide about skin? And the answer is, well, if I was talking about antihistamines, you wouldn't be at all surprised. You'd be surprised if I put up a brain slide. But all of the SSRIs are antihistamines, and many of the antihistamines are SSRIs. And among the prominent complaints that people have when they're trying to come off these drugs are skin complaints. There's altered sensation, altered touch, burning feet, allergic phenomena, inflammatory phenomena. These are terribly common things that we ignore because we're thinking brain. This slide shows you a little bit more about the kind of thing we expect from withdrawal from an antidepressant. This is called electric head or brain zaps, or things like this. And it looks like there's some kind of convulsion going on in the brain, leaving people with a shocking feeling traveling right down the body. It's serious and it's terribly disconcerting. But one of the other shocking things about it is if you go into a website which is looking at what do we know about what causes brain zaps, you find that they say clearly this has not been researched because we don't want to admit that they're happening because we don't want to deter people from taking their antidepressants by thinking they could get hooked to them. What we do know about brain zaps, though, is they're not happening in the brain. They're happening in the scalp, the skin and muscles of the scalp, and in your eyes. They're triggered mostly by moving your eyes. That's what triggers them. It's nothing to do with your brain, although you feel as though it's coming from the brain. But as I said, part of the shocking thing with all this is if we're doing science, something like this, something extraordinary we've never seen before, like brain zaps, should lead to researchers pouring in, trying to sort the problem out, just like these garden enthusiasts here. But that's not what happens. And as the websites tell you, it's deliberate that it's not happening. People are not encouraged to research this, which might shed some bad light on this group of drugs. So let me explore this brain zap area a bit more and take you back 150 years to Germany, where 3 different doctors in 3 different bits of Germany report on 3 different patients who have an I'm going to die experience. And in each case, it happens to them in a crowded place. One of the doctors say this is something to do with the way they're processing visual information. That's what triggers it off. The other 2 say, well, it's to do with their nerves. But nerves back then did not mean a psychological problem. They meant a real problem with your real nerves, okay? Well, we've found out over the years, we didn't know what triggered it, but we found that, with behavior therapy, if you worked on people to get them to avoid avoiding things, because people who had this kind of experience didn't want to go back to crowded places. So you encouraged them to go back, and that was good. That helped people get on with life. 100 years later, a man called Don Klein said, let's stop this avoidance stuff. Let's get back to the I'm going to die moment. That's the crucial thing we need to focus in on. And he talked about it in terms of panic attacks and said they were caused by a suffocation reflex that left you feeling I'm going to die. Turns out that we haven't been able to find any evidence for a suffocation reflex, although there is some evidence that people can have cardiac problems that we weren't able to pick up before. The latest well, one of the other things is that when we didn't find the trigger to the whole thing, we did find that cognitive behavior therapy could be very useful in getting people to prove to themselves that they weren't having the heart attack they thought they were having and stopping trying to avoid things and getting inhibited by this awful experience. The latest incarnation of this phenomenon, which you probably haven't heard about, is called PPPD. And PPPD is persistent postural perceptual dizziness. Imagine you're up on a tightrope and you get dizzy. You're going to have an I'm going to die moment. And after you come off the tightrope, let's say you haven't fallen and haven't died, you're not going to go up there again in a hurry. Now, PPPD is a problem that of balance, which has led people to do a lot of work on how do we balance ourselves. And the view is, well, a lot of it comes from our eyes. That's awfully important. A lot of it comes from the vestibules of our inner ear. That's awfully important. And sometimes, in some cases, you've got people who have vestibular problems. And when you take that into account, vestibular rehabilitation therapy can help them with this I'm going to die experience. But another part of it comes from what's called the proprioceptive system, which is a bunch of sensory receptors around the body in our bones, our joints, our muscles, and things like that, which are critical to telling the body where our various bits are. And there's serotonin and dopamine input into the eyes and the vestibules and the proprioceptive system. Mess with that, and you're likely to compromise an elite athlete or a pianist or whatever who depends critically on all these little bits of things functioning right. Now, because only a few people have a clear vestibular problem, a lot of people dealing with PPPD figure it's caused by anxiety. You know, it's a bit like the avoidance behavior, and we need to tell people that they need trauma therapy to find the trauma in their past that has caused all this, and they need SSRIs, which people are told cure the problem. Now, the problem with this is when you go on an SSRI first, they can cause you to be dizzy. And nobody who thinks PPPD is a real thing thinks SSRIs cause it, and I agree with them. But the people who describe PPPD first agree with me that when you come off an SSRI as just healthy volunteers put on these drugs for only 2 weeks, one of the prominent complaints is severe dizziness when they come off. They also become anxious and they also become depressed, but severe dizziness on withdrawal can trigger PPPD. We've got a bunch of people who get diagnosed with PPPD after they come off the SSRI and are told the answer to your problem is to go on an SSRI or get trauma therapy or both. Now, here's this marvelous painting by Nikki McQueen called Juggling Act, which in a sense encapsulates this entire talk that I'm giving. And she's showing that, you know, we spend years of our life learning how to juggle our bodies, and things can disrupt that. And you see the eyeball there in the guy's right hand. Well, one of the problems we know happens with drugs acting on the serotonin system for migraine or SSRIs is you can get a thing called visual snow syndrome. And you won't be surprised to hear that people think this is a problem that's all on your mind. And one of the treatments for it's probably SSRIs, even though SSRIs appear to be the drugs most commonly causing it. What is visual snow syndrome? Well, up on the upper left there, you see an image that's not terribly clear, but you can see the right-hand half of it is not as clear as the left-hand half. And this is because there's a lot of snow or dots or things in the way of you being able to see things crisply and clearly. One of the other problems with it is this after image problem you see with the banana called palinopsia. On the right-hand side there, at the top, we've all got floaters, these little things that float across our eyes, black things, which ophthalmologists looking into your eye can see and agree that you have a floater. People with visual snow syndrome have tons of them, but when the ophthalmologists look in their eyes, they can't see any. The other thing that people with visual snow syndrome complain about is when they go out to drive the car at night, they can't see anything at all. And it's dangerous. And if they need to drive at night for their work, they may have to stop work. They may not be able to socialize. It really inhibits their life pretty badly. So this is a devastating problem, with ophthalmologists thinking that, you know, you're there saying you think about actually committing suicide, you've given up work, you think you've got eye problems, but we can't spot a thing in your eyes at all. So they conclude that you've got a nervous problem, you've got a mental problem, and the answer is trauma therapy or SSRIs. The condition you have is usually labeled these days as functional neurological disorder, FND. And we've got an epidemic of FND these days, which for me is an instance of over-specialization is what's causing this. We've got a bunch of ophthalmologists or other people who are great when it comes to eye issues, but not so great on drug toxicity, which will produce symptoms right across the entire body. And if you're asking an ophthalmologist to take into account things that are happening elsewhere in the body and to conclude that this is a toxic effect of a drug, well, they just don't do it. They slip into, as doctors in every area of medicine these days are increasingly inclined to do, to thinking this is a mental problem. And the problem for people who had a mental problem and got put on SSRIs is when they stop. The common complaints are things like dizziness, or visual snow, which may start after you halt the drugs, are anxiety or depression. Even healthy volunteers just on these drugs for 2 weeks may become intensely anxious, depressive, and try to kill themselves. So if you're a patient who says you've become anxious or depressed when you halt the drugs, the doctors are going to say, for sure, this is just the original illness you had, and you need to remain on these drugs for the rest of your life. You don't, and you shouldn't. Here's another condition that will lead to people thinking you've got a mental illness. One of these two people is on or was on an SSRI. We don't know which, and we don't know if it is or was. When you go on an SSRI, the single commonest thing that happens is you become genitally numb. And when you come off, your expectation is the numbness will go, your orgasms will lighten up again, and your libido will improve. But exactly the opposite can happen. You may be left even more numb with 0 orgasms and 0 libido for the rest of your life. No one's told about this before they go on the drugs because we don't want to deter you from getting the benefit. We've known about this problem since the early 1960s when the first antidepressants came out. We knew doctors could tell then the difference between a thing caused by depression and something caused by the antidepressant used to treat it. By the early 1970s, these drugs were being used like clomipramine to treat premature ejaculation problems. It just took 1/10 of an antidepressant dose 30 minutes before you made love for the man to be able to last longer and for things to be better for the couple. By the mid-1980s, we knew that some people coming off these older drugs, which also inhibited serotonin reuptake strongly, could have a post-SSRI or post-antidepressant problem. When you come off the drugs, when you come off the SSRI and have sexual problems, this is post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. You can also get just the opposite. The drugs, instead of causing genital numbness, they can cause genital irritability, and this can lead to this can lead to PGAD, which is persistent genital arousal disorder, which can be so disturbing that women ask for a clitoridectomy to try and solve it. We knew in the mid-1980s when the companies gave these drugs to healthy volunteers that sexual problems were among the problems that were complained about most bitterly, and in some cases appeared to have lasted after the drugs were halted, and when the person had only been on them for 2 weeks. So doctors like me, not knowing about this, running clinical trials on patients, were told, don't ask about sex, which meant the companies were able to claim, our drugs rarely have a problem as regards your ability to make love. And the hint was, when you stop the drugs, say for the weekend, if you want to go away for a weekend, everything will be just fine. Companies knew this was not true. Regulators have had reports about what we know as PSSD and PGAD for 30 years now, and have done nothing about them. Some of the people doing the reporting 30 years ago still have the problem to this day. And on the theme of patients knowing more about the science than doctors, and motivation being worth more than expertise, this PSSD Network podcast is tremendous science. You got these 3 guys who have no background in healthcare, no background in the science of the things, who got PSSD and talk in an amazing fashion about what it's like to have the problems, what it's like to go into a doctor, and it's a bit like going in and you've had your arm chopped off and the doctor can't spot the problem. You know you're missing an arm, you know that you're missing an important sense, but the doctor can't see it or is paying no heed to it. And Roy says, well, you don't just lose an arm, you lose an arm and a leg. You lose an erotic sense, but also you lose an emotional sense. And Bryn says, one of our problems with all this, guys, is, anyone listening to us will say this can't be the case because FDA wouldn't have let a drug like this on the market if it caused something like this. Well, in terms of FDA letting a drug on the market causing something like this, if you go to NHS Digital, or if you ask the Pope or Joe Biden or anyone you care to think about, what are the side effects of SSRIs? You'll find something like this, which says, they may cause headache, they may cause nausea. No hint that you may never be able to get off them. No hint they may wipe out your ability to make love, wipe out your fertility, and this will never recover. Nothing is there. If you ask people why, they say in print, because we don't want to deter people from taking the drugs. We've done research to find out how people would respond to this kind of information, and they respond by saying, well, we're not sure we need these drugs, which is not apparently what the system wants. And a few years ago, this led to an article at the BMJ, which featured on the front cover of the journal saying, the Brits and most of the Western world are not making love the way they used to do. It's much rarer. What the authors of the article said was this is caused by people being more depressed than they were. It's not. The kind of depression SSRIs treat is mild. It's anxiety. And when we're anxious or tense, we often turn to things like food or making love or whatever. This kind of problem is not a problem that interferes with our libido or our ability to make love. The antidepressants do that, but BMJ's lawyers wouldn't let the authors of an article like this say that the drugs could be causing the problem. And that's leading to a major problem across the developed world, which is for the population to remain the same, the reproductive replacement rate has to be 2.1. But in the UK a few years ago, it had fallen to 1.56, and parts of the country had much, much lower rates than that, some as low as 0.6. It tends to be the white and more affluent areas that are having the least births. And this is a problem that's a Western world problem at the moment, and linked to the fact that the SSRIs don't just cause PSSD and PGAD, they can wipe out a man's sperm count, they can impair a woman's ability to conceive and carry a pregnancy through the whole way. So the drugs are playing a major part in our ability to turn a problem like this around. While we've got 15% of the population on these drugs, which means 20 or 30% of the population not able to make love the way they might want to, this is not a problem that's going to be turned around all that easily. Which brings me back to William James. I'm going to deal with the issue about how do we solve antidepressant withdrawal now, but just I want to give the guys one more challenge before we do that, which is, does their thinking apply to the antipsychotic group of drugs as well? Crazy ideas. Psychosis is surely a brain thing. It's not something coming from the body. The body may get tense muscles, but it's not going to get crazy ideas, is it? Well, part of the reason we bought the idea that there might be lowered serotonin in the brains of people who are depressed is because of this, which is this shows lowered dopamine levels in the brains of people who've got Parkinson's disease. So this helped us view these conditions as something that might have lowered levels of chemical neurotransmitters. And Arvid Carlson's Nobel Prize came from work on dopamine in the brain. Unlike serotonin and norepinephrine and all those other neurotransmitters which were discovered in the body, dopamine was discovered in the brain. And if you Google the dopamine system, you'll get an image like this. You'll get a brain. You won't get the body, even though very little of the dopamine in you and me is in our brains. Most of it is in the rest of our bodies, like the serotonin we have. If you look at the history of the antipsychotics, these two are antihistamines. And the first use of chlorpromazine, the first of these drugs, was when a surgeon gave it to a patient who was about to have an operation, and he thought it might counteract the physical stress of cutting into the human body. But before he cut into the body and put it, well, before he put it to sleep and cut into the body, he noticed she was in a strange and different state he hadn't seen before. She was chilled out. She didn't seem to be worried about the operation. So it was a noticeable effect that came on instantly. One of the surgeon's friends was then took the drug to see what happened and drove his car home and came in the next day and said, I drove through a red light. So it looked like his red means stop reflex was gone. And that's what, when we began to give the drugs to patients, that's what people reported as well. That, they were wide awake, they could talk to you, they could do things quite normally, better than before, but a lot of the extra things that they didn't need to do seemed not to happen. And here's one instance of this. Long before we could do brain scans to see what was going on, this is just a handwriting test. Nothing interesting about what gets written, but if you look at the top bit of writing, the first two lines, it's repeat on the two lines below it, and it's much smaller. This is in a patient who's just been put on one of these drugs. Further down below the print, you've got a small bit of handwriting, and then you've got underneath it a much bigger version of the same thing. And this is after a patient has come off one of these drugs. We can show that what these drugs do is they induce an economy of effort kind of effect. You don't do things that you don't have to do. You keep it to a minimum. You'll talk to people, but maybe without smiling or moving your hands the way I am. This has nothing much to do with the brain, and this is the only useful thing these drugs do. They don't change your psychotic thinking. I'm going to come back to that now in a second. The other thing that we've become more aware of here now is that Parkinson's disease is not a brain disease. It maybe doesn't begin in the gut, but certainly before it gets to the brain, things have gone wrong in the gut, proteins misfold, they end up in the nerves in the gut and travel up the great thing, the vagus nerve, which leads into the brain. It's not a nerve coming out of the brain, it's leading into the brain, and then they get deposited in the bit of the brain you saw, which in the form of what are called Lewy bodies, which are the way we diagnose Parkinson's disease. And these replace the dopamine that may have been in the brain before that. So this is called the Brack hypothesis. And we now know that people who have had gut problems are more likely to go on to Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. If you had your appendix out and your vagus nerve cut, you're much less likely to get either of those illnesses. We know, if you look back through the history of people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, that they've got a history of gut problems before they get the Parkinson's diagnosis. But it's probably not just a gut thing. Many years ago, I gave Risperdal to a patient who said, yes, this drug is awfully helpful for me, but my wife says it's changed my smell as well. And this was around the time that Joy found a change in smell in Les, her husband. And 10 years later, he got Parkinson's. It's now clear that Joy and some other people can smell whatever it is Parkinson's disease is years and years and years before people show any signs of what we think of as Parkinson's. And we've been able to pick out the chemicals in the skin that Joy's smelling that lead her to say this is going to be Parkinson's disease. And hopefully we're going to be able to use that to work out just how people end up with this condition at all and hopefully prevent it. In the meantime, what we need to recognize, the economy of effort thing which you get with a very low dose of these drugs is all the useful thing that they do. Putting the dose up higher can only cause problems. And one of my patients brings this out beautifully. This is a man who had a lot of crazy ideas the whole time, and because of this, people have put the dose of the drugs up higher and higher and higher. And when we were doing a cognitive therapy of psychosis project, talking to him, it became clear that he had all these kind of experiences in his body that he blamed on awful forces. listening to him, my view was this has been caused by the drugs you're on. But explaining this to him and proving it in the sense of withdrawing the high doses of the antipsychotics he was on was only going to cause more symptoms. So we're in a bind. We're going to be feeding the drugs we had him on, and withdrawing from them was just going to feed any delusional beliefs he had. These were not a cure. We need to be prepared to leave people like me with some crazy ideas like this, but calm us down if need be with a low dose of these pills rather than figuring they're antipsychotic and we need to increase the dose till the problem goes away. What's the role of the brain, the cortex in all this, the interpretation of what's going on? Well, our brains are the place that pharmaceutical companies can intervene to program us to see the illnesses and the pills used to treat the illnesses the way they, both doctors and patients, the way they want us to see the problem. And the way they want us to see the problem is this, that these drugs are magic bullets that get in and do the job and sort everything out. And there's nothing for a doctor to do except prescribe them, and nothing for a patient to do except take them. But that's not what most of the drugs we have in medicine do. Most of what we have are a little bit like laxatives, which you see here. There's 4 different kinds of constipation and 4 different kinds of laxatives. And the clinical skill is being able to pick the right laxative for the kind of constipation you have. Put you on the wrong laxative, and we may be in the business of creating treatment-resistant constipation. Doctors and even mothers of young children used to be pretty good at working out what kind of constipation this was and what kind of laxative might help. But if a company gets approved by FDA to call their compound a laxative, their interest is in making sure that everybody who's got constipation has their laxative. They don't mind if you have the other kinds as well, but they're not in the business of just ensuring you get the right kind for you. This is a way to create treatment-resistant constipation. The same applies to antihypertensives, hypoglycemics, and antidepressants. You've got the serenic SSRIs, vigilance-enhancing norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, tonics that improve your appetite and sleep like mirtazapine, are tricyclics which can treat melancholia the way all of the others can't. Put you on the wrong drug for you and create treatment. We can create treatment-resistant depression. Like in the case of the SSRIs, we can create protracted withdrawal problems or PSSD that's not going to go away, and leaving people figuring that the only option now is medical assistance in dying. And an increasing number of people are turning to just that because of the problems we're causing by companies ensuring that everybody who's depressed gets an SSRI. Should everybody who's depressed or has OCD get an SSRI? Well, I've explained to you that a drug that works for me may have the opposite effect in you. A problem I get on the drug, like PSSD, you may have the opposite effect, PGAD. I want to tell you now about my favorite researcher, who's a man who had OCD, who his job involved, fixing heating boilers, and this meant taking out a bunch of wires and putting them all back in the right place. And this used to cause him agonies. Did he have everything back exactly the way it should be? It really was coming to the point where he couldn't work anymore. He was a terribly nice man. I really wanted to help him, so I gave him an SSRI. Didn't help. We increased the dose, didn't help. Switched to clomipramine, didn't help. Added an antipsychotic, didn't help. Then, after we've been at this for a few months, he comes in one day to the clinic and says, I'm a bit better. And I'm pleased. He says, I halted all the pills you put me on. I was very pleased. The only thing that counted was he had to be better. Then he said to me, I also began smoking. And this didn't bother me at all. I was really quite pleased with this. And he said, before I started smoking, I did some research and I found these articles which says that nicotine and drugs like this can be good for OCD and anxiety and a few problems like that. So he handed me a bunch of articles. He knew nothing about the people or things like that behind it. And as luck would have it, I knew one of the people who was on the authorship line of the top article that he handed me. It was Arvid Carlsson, the man who created the SSRIs by listening to patients, had also listened to patients with OCD who had been treated with SSRIs and they hadn't worked, but who had said to him, look, nicotine and smoking works for me. So he said, let's do a trial of this. And he had said, absolutely. There are a bunch of patients who will not respond to SSRIs who respond beautifully to smoking. From Carlson's point of view, nicotine can be a therapeutic principle for OCD, or anxiety, or what we call depression. These SSRIs, his own drug is not a magic bullet. He introduced me to the idea of therapeutic principles. Now, one of the big problems we have that gets in the way of everything is what you see here, which is 400 years ago, Descartes located a ghost in the machinery, in the pineal gland. This is where our soul is. And, we'd recently discovered nerves in the human body. And he said, when you put your foot too close to the fire, an image of the flame travels up these nervous fibers to the pineal gland where the soul looks at it and decides, the wise thing would be to take the foot away from the fire. So what we call reflex behaviors now meant for Descartes that the soul had seen what was going on and reflected on it, and our action to remove our foot was a wise and thoughtful action. It took nearly 200 years for people to realize that this was just plain wrong, that there was no wisdom of the brain involved, there was a wisdom of the body involved, that reflex actions were things that didn't happen with a lot of thought involved in them. They happened because the body is wise in all sorts of ways. And after this breakthrough in the following 100 years, we found that more and more and more of our behaviors are reflex. They're not something that involves the cortex of the brain at all. In fact, almost all our behaviors, from posture to balance to all sorts of things, the brain isn't involved in all these things, to the point where some people even said, well, consciousness is no more important to us than the steam whistle of a locomotive. You can get rid of the steam whistle and the locomotive will still be able to work pretty well. How does this fit into withdrawal from the antidepressants or the antipsychotics, which are just about the anticonvulsants? Well, the first bit of the problem is there's a great deterrence in place with recognizing there's a problem at all. Everybody from President Biden to the Pope are not willing to entertain the idea that these sacraments we have could be causing any problems at all. There's medical specialization, which is getting in the way of people recognizing drug toxicity in a way we used to be able to recognize it 60 years ago when the drugs came out first. There's the fact that the withdrawal problems, that dependence on these drugs produces a complex chemical imbalance, so that, we could have people like me could have a totally different experience on these drugs to you. We might both be on 4 drugs, and I could stop 3 of them, no problem, but have terrible problems with the 4th. You could stop 3 of them with no problem, including the one that I had awful problems with, but you might have terrible problems with one that I could stop easily. And people get blamed for not being able to stop a drug, when actually they're able to stop a lot of these drugs very easily, but for reasons we don't understand, one of these drugs can cause awful problems. And I might have PSSD after I halt, whereas you might have exactly the opposite, PGAD. Your heart rate may go up and mine may go down. We can have complex problems like PPPD, which no one understands really, or VSS, which no one understands. These are all part of the protracted withdrawal problems people can have, part of the problems that can come on after you've stopped the drug. They may not have been there before you stopped the drug. Our brain bias has led us to think these are all happening in our brain. They're not. They're happening in our body. And the crucial thing is, in terms of people becoming anxious and depressed, it's terribly difficult for doctors anywhere to figure this isn't a nervous problem, when in fact, it's a body problem. We're tending to shoot the messenger, the people who come and try and report to us, what's actually happening to them, who have great insight on what's happening to them, we shoot them. We don't recognize that the substance abuse problems that worry us a lot are things that we are causing with the prescription drugs we're using. Now, recently, there's been a move to say, look, we need to get people off antidepressants, which is great, and that, we understand more about how to do it. And people are talking about hyperbolic tapering, how you need to go slowly, particularly towards the end. This is a great idea in terms of encouraging you to think we understand what's going on, and you really should try to get off these drugs, and you will be able to get off a bunch of them, maybe without too much problem, but it's not a correct idea. First of all, as you see in this slide, it says under the word fluoxetine, it says striatum, which is a bit of the brain. There's almost no serotonin in your brain or in your striatum. It's all in the rest of the body, where it links up with ACE receptors and piezo2 proteins and things like this, which it's not. When we get people successfully off drugs like this, it's rarely got much to do with the serotonin system at all. Like over on the right, you see the opioid problem again. We can kill opioid withdrawal stone dead with drugs acting on the adrenergic system in the locus coeruleus. Nothing, we don't need to taper the opioids at all. It's nothing necessarily to do with the system on which the problem drug acts. It's the knock-on effects on other bits of the body that give rise to the problem. And if we don't understand where these are, we don't have much chance of trying to sort them out if they go wrong. And part of the issue here is most of our behavior these days is automatic. It's controlled by circadian clocks and things like that, which put you to sleep whether your brain wants to go asleep or not. We're sharp at certain times of the day and not others. This has nothing to do with voluntariness or willpower or things like that. And when automatic things go wrong, the brain trying to put them right is a recipe for disaster. Giving this frog trauma therapy or an SSRI is not going to solve the problem he's got. Now, there's a few things that get people who are in withdrawal report commonly. One is brain fog, and they say, well, my brain's not working right. This must mean that it's damaged by antidepressants. And it doesn't mean that. From elite athletes to concert pianists and things like that who've been on these drugs and find that they're not functioning all that well, even though their mood disorder is picked up. What happens when you're not functioning, when you're playing the keys of the piano, your brain tries to help by focusing, by concentrating, which is, you don't have a problem that can be solved by the brain focusing. It can only be made worse. You get frustrated when this doesn't work. The only way to solve the problem is to go back and practice endlessly till it becomes automatic and you don't think about it. This is true for concert pianists, for elite athletes, and for the rest of us. The other problem is akathisia, which gives rise to almost psychotic ideas about killing others or killing yourself or whatever. Surely psychotic ideas are in the brain. Well, in one sense they are, in the sense the brain is trying to make sense of what's going on, but it's a bit like the persistent genital arousal disorder. This is a genital akathisia that can be so distressing, it can lead to orgasms triggered by the vibration of the car you're driving. You can have 10s, 20s of orgasms per day. It's awfully distressing in social kind of situations and things like that. And it's so bad that women have clitoridectomies to try and sort the problem out. Nobody intends, nobody voluntarily has a clitoridectomy. It's the brain trying to interpret what's going on. It doesn't recognize the problem is caused by sensory changes that the drug has caused. And this feeds into issues about homicide, changes of personality on these drugs and all, that we haven't begun to grapple with or understand. And I'm going to pick that point up on the last slide. So what I'm saying to you here is that the action with all these drugs is in the body. It's not in the brain. The brain may come up with some very strange ideas to try and explain what's going on, but that's not where the problem really lies. It lies in our bodies. the serotonin and dopamine in me and you, 90% of the serotonin is in our gut and 50% of the dopamine is in our gut. And most of the rest of these hormones are in the rest of our body, not in our brain. When people began to get COVID and got vaccines for COVID, they seem to have also caused brain zaps. And one thing we know about antibodies and things like that is they don't get into the brain. So this is happening elsewhere. The other thing, I mean, you see the lady here with the burning feet. This is a common feature of withdrawal from all these drugs, and it's called peripheral neuropathy. It can lead to very distressing situations where people's feet literally do feel like they're on fire. They have all sorts of odd and strange kind of sensations. One thing we know now at the moment is that one of the group of drugs that can help most is what are called anticholinergic drugs. These are drugs that have been vilified in the rest of medicine. People are told you don't need to be using them. But in fact, they look like they're the only drugs that potentially can cause peripheral nerve fibers to regrow. And they look like they can cure peripheral neuropathies, or at least hugely improve them. And yet predicts really that these should have a place in the treatment of conditions like protracted withdrawal on antidepressants, of which peripheral neuropathy is one part. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done before we get to the point of knowing exactly what to do. Now, this brings us back to Nicky McQueen's juggling act, which I think is amazing. And really, everything I'm saying is in this one picture, which is, we spend the first few years of our life juggling bits of our body to get them to work in the way we need them to work in order to be able to live. Anyone who's had a young child will know that the learning, the juggling goes on the whole time. They get up on their feet and walk and fall over. And by the time they get to about the age of 2, or maybe a bit before, you can put on a bit of music there in the background, and they'll bop to it. No one's ever taught them how to bop or how to move rhythmically, but they've mastered their bodies to the point where they can do this kind of thing. There's nothing particularly cortical about it. In the case of reptiles like birds, you can see the murmurations of huge numbers of birds and think this is extraordinary behavior, but it's all done without a cortex. They migrate for tens of thousands of miles without a cortex, so huge amounts of things can be done without a cortex. What does the cortex do for us? Well, probably when you're doing ballet and the orchestra's making a mistake and you've got to work out how best to, not interrupt the performance, that's the kind of thing that our cortexes can do for us. They give us flexibility, which can help us override some of the automatic issues that we can have from time to time. But that's only terribly important, but relatively minor in the sense of the amount of our behavior that's shaped by this is relatively small. Now, this is not just an antidepressant or antipsychotic issue or benzodiazepine issue. I had a friend some years ago who was on Nexium, who had an I'm going to die moment. He was on it for reflux. There's a lot of other drugs that can cause this kind of thing. We've got Ozempic now, which is producing extraordinary changes that, the message we need is a bit like the one I gave Pfizer 30 years ago, which is we're going to see things we've never seen before. We need to listen to patients. Doctors need to listen to patients. The things that they're telling them have changed on this pill. But of course, Novo Nordics, who make this drug, aren't going to encourage doctors. Or Lilly, who make the other drug on the market or whatever, they're not going to encourage doctors to listen to patients and pay any heed to what the experts, the researchers on these drugs have to say. My prize exhibit is up there at the top. Merck produced Singulair for asthma, and this can cause people to become suicidal and homicidal and hooked to the drug and have awful problems trying to come off it. The issues can last for months or years afterwards. And Merck deny completely that this can happen. And their argument says, look, this can't be happening on our drug. Our drug doesn't get into the brain. So this is exactly the message of my talk. And when I get sued for the talk, the first witnesses I'm going to call on my behalf will be Merck. We've reached a situation where the greatest challenge in medicine now is the number of drugs people are on. And they're all on these drugs because they work. And nobody's thought about the safety issues, but a lot of these drugs people are on can explode when you try and remove them. In terms of moving forward, there's never going to be any controlled trials that will help us. There's never going to be any guidelines that will help us. Some clinical experience on the part of the doctor may help, but really what's required is a close working scientific relationship between the doctor and the patient, who's the key scientist here, who has the most details about which of these drugs can be removed kind of safely, and is going to be a critical partner in maneuvering a way around all of the hazards you see here. Now, in terms of the patient maneuvering around, even with people doing the best job they can, some of these bombs are going to explode and can kill people. And people who have been injured by this, are, the families that are left behind, may be terribly angry with FDA or pharmaceutical companies. They'll talk about FDA corruption. But FDA are not corrupt. The problem lies in doctors and healthcare personnel who haven't done their job properly. FDA keep to the letter of what they're asked to do. And we've asked them to test for abuse liability. We've asked them to put on black box warnings to drugs causing people to become suicidal, and they have done that. We have not asked them to get companies to check what are the symptoms on stopping, the SOS features of their drug that we need to know about before we go on these drugs, in order to work out, is it a reasonable thing to do, in order to make sure we don't end up on 5 or 6 or more of these drugs that can be terribly difficult to halt. And part of the problem here is company trials are focused on showing their drugs work, on efficiency. The mindset of the companies and FDA is, once the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. This is taken from a song by Tom Lehrer in 1965. We need to ensure it is FDA's department and companies' department to work out where these things come down and what the harms might be. And it's people like me, other doctors, who have been failing you in this respect. So to sum up the talk, it's the Loinig cartoon that you've seen earlier turned inside out. This has been doctored to show that the lady is now saying antidepressants cause a complex chemical imbalance. From my research, I know that, the problems I have are likely to clear up without any pills in a few weeks' time, and normality will be restored. You now have a happy doctor who's grateful that he's not facing heart-sink patients that he doesn't know how to treat. He's now got a bunch of free researchers who are going to make his life and his job much more interesting and things like that, than it has been with people that he just gives the same old pills to that don't seem to sort the problems out. Life could become much better for both doctors and patients if we turn things around like this. This slide got doctored before I got the invite to give this talk, and it's got a mistake in it. It's the bottom word up there on the top left, which should not be brain. It should be antidepressants cause a complex chemical imbalance in the body. And when we're stuck on these drugs and related drugs on a medical outcrop of protracted withdrawal, what we've got to do in order to move things forward is to stop fantasizing about the things that we're being told these drugs do. We need to focus much more, not on our fantasies about what they do, but on the material me. We need to forget the ghost in the machinery of me, and we need to focus on the material me and understand that if we want to move things forward. Thank you.